You can grow more food in a single spare room using nothing but water, an old tin bath, and a bit of patience than most gardeners manage in a full season of soil and sweat. Families in the Yorkshire Dales were doing exactly this 80 years ago, when there was no soil to spare and no shop shelves to rely on. My name is Arthur Whitfield. I grew up on a small holding in the Yorkshire Dales in a stone farmhouse. My family had worked for 3 generations. Winters up there were long. The ground froze hard from November through to March, and good growing soil was something you protected carefully rather than something you took for granted. My grandfather taught me most of what I know about feeding a household without depending on anyone else for it. One of the strangest things he ever showed me when I was no more than 8 or 9 was a row of vegetables growing in old tin baths, their roots hanging free in water, with no soil in sight at all. I remember standing on an upturned crate to peer over the rim of that bath, half expecting the lettuce to simply drown. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. These were not experiments to him. They were survival, born out of years when good soil was scarce, land was rationed, and every household was expected to grow something, anywhere it could be grown. He had learned the method himself from his own father, who had kept a household running through the years of the First War, when imported food was scarce and every scrap of growing space mattered. I watched those tin baths produce lettuce, herbs, and tomatoes season after season, long before anyone had given the practice a fancy name. There was no talk of hydroponics in our kitchen. There was simply the plain understanding that a plant needs water, minerals, and light, and that soil was only ever one way among several of delivering those things. I am sharing it now because very few people alive today were ever shown how it is properly done. Somewhere along the way, growing food without soil became something sold back to us in plastic kits and complicated machines with subscription nutrients and instructions written to make it sound far harder than it ever needed to be. The companies selling those kits have every reason to keep it looking complicated, because a bucket, a bit of rope, and a jar of nettle feed does not need reordering every month. A branded bottle of liquid feed will tell you it contains a precise patented formula, when in truth it is largely the same handful of minerals that comfrey and nettle have been pulling out of the ground and offering back to us for centuries what my grandfather managed with tin baths and rainwater. Modern companies now sell for hundreds of pounds, dressed up in language meant to make you feel you cannot manage without them. None of this is said out of bitterness toward anyone. It is simply worth knowing plainly, because once you know it, you stop feeling as though you need permission or a subscription to grow your own food. What you are about to hear is not a theory dressed up for a camera. These methods were tested through real shortages by people who had no other choice but to make them work. They worked then, and they still work exactly the same way today. The first thing to understand is that you do not need a single piece of expensive equipment to begin. The simplest method my grandfather ever used was what country folk called the wick method, long before anyone called it hydroponics at all. You take a container of water mixed with a mild nutrient feed, and you sit a smaller pot of growing medium above it, connected by a length of cotton rope or old woolen wick that draws the water upward through capillary action, the same way a candle wick draws up melted wax. No pump, no electricity, no moving parts to fail on you. The plant simply pulls up what it needs, hour by hour, as it needs it. This was the method used in thousands of English homes during the hardest years of rationing. When coal for machinery was scarce but a bit of old rope was always to hand, an old woolen sock, unpicked into a single length of yarn, works just as well as any purchased wick, and my grandfather rarely used anything else. The thickness of the wick matters more than people expect. Too thin, and it cannot draw up enough water to satisfy a thirsty plant on a warm day. Too thick, and it will flood the growing medium and drown the very roots you are trying to feed. A wick, roughly the thickness of a pencil, suits most small pots, and you will know within the first day or two whether the medium above is staying pleasantly moist or turning either bone dry or waterlogged. If you want to start this evening, a large jam jar, a strip of old flannel, and a small pot with holes cut in the bottom will get you further than any starter kit sold in a shop. But that is only the first part. Before you build anything further, you need to understand what a plant is actually asking for, because that changes everything about how you feed it. Soil, in truth, was never anything more than a delivery system. The plant does not eat soil itself. It draws up water carrying dissolved minerals, mainly nitrogen for leaf growth, phosphorus for root and flower development, and potassium for overall strength and resistance to disease. Take away the soil, and you simply have to deliver those same minerals a different way through the water itself. There are smaller minerals too: calcium for strong cell walls, magnesium for the green coloring in every leaf, and a handful of trace elements needed only in tiny amounts, but a good general feed, whether bought or brewed at home, carries all of these without you needing to measure a single one separately. My grandfather did this with two simple homemade feeds, comfrey tea and nettle tea, both made by soaking a bucket of chopped leaves in rainwater for 2 to 3 weeks until it turned dark and, frankly, rather foul-smelling. Nettle tea was rich in nitrogen and used early in a plant's life to build strong leaves. Comfrey tea was richer in potassium and used once flowers or fruit began to form, because comfrey draws deep minerals up from far below the surface where its roots reach, diluted at roughly 1 part feed to 10 parts water. These two brews alone fed entire households of vegetables without a single bag of shop-bought fertilizer. There is a third feed worth knowing, one my grandmother favored for anything struggling to establish itself, made simply by soaking wood ash from the fire grate in a muslin cloth within a bucket of rainwater for a few days. Wood ash carries potassium in a form plants take up easily, and in a farmhouse with an open fire burning through every winter, it costs nothing at all beyond the trouble of gathering it. None of these feeds needs to be measured with any great precision. The old rule was simple, weak, and often rather than strong and rare, because a plant fed little and frequently grows steadier than one fed heavily, and left to go hungry between doses. Keep watching, because the second method is where most beginners are genuinely surprised by how little they actually need to buy. Let's build your first real setup, and before you head to a garden center, take a look around your own kitchen. An old ice cream tub works as a reservoir, so does a plastic washing up bowl. Even an old tin bath from a car boot sale will do the job. For your growing pots, empty yogurt containers with a few holes cut in the bottom work just as well as anything you'd buy. Now think about what the roots sit in. You want something that holds a little moisture, but still lets air reach the roots. Perlite and vermiculite are cheap and easy to find at any garden supplier. They do the same job my grandfather's old mix did: coursed sand and crushed eggshell, sieved fine enough to hold water, but never so fine it packed down and choked the roots. No perlite on hand. Clean pea gravel mixed with coconut coir works almost as well and costs next to nothing. Before any container goes into your system, scrub it out with hot water and a splash of vinegar. Leftover soap or food residue can damage young roots faster than you'd think. Dark containers are always better for holding water. If yours is clear or pale, wrap it in newspaper or give it a coat of dark paint. It takes minutes. This whole setup can cost less than a single takeaway dinner, and it will keep producing for months. Here's what surprises most beginners: how much light a plant really needs indoors. A windowsill that looks bright to your eye is often far dimmer than your plant needs. Leafy greens like lettuce and herbs want 6 to 8 hours of good light a day. A south-facing windowsill in England, especially in the darker months, rarely gives that much on its own. My grandmother's trick was simple: paint the wall behind the windowsill white. A pale, reflective wall bounces far more daylight back onto the leaves than a dark one ever will. If natural light just isn't enough, a basic fluorescent tube or a low wattage grow bulb does the job. Keep it about a foot above the plants, run it for around 12 hours a day, and you won't spend much on electricity. Skip the most expensive lamp on the shelf. A plant can't tell a cheap bulb from an expensive one, as long as the light and the hours are right. Here's an old test my grandfather used, long before light meters existed. Hold your hand where the leaves will sit and try to read fine print by the light there. Can't read it? The plant is probably struggling too. Lower the lamp or add another hour or two to the day. Turn your containers a quarter turn every few days. Plants lean hard toward their light source, and a setup left facing one way for weeks grows lopsided and weak on the shaded side. Starting seedlings is where a lot of people quit before they've even begun, but it's simple. Dampen a folded sheet of kitchen roll. Lay your seeds across it, fold it over, and set it somewhere warm near a stove or radiator. My grandfather always started seeds on the mantel shelf above the kitchen range, where the rising heat kept them steady all night. Most lettuce, herb, and tomato seeds show their first white root within 3 to 7 days. Once you spot that root, move the seedling gently into your growing medium. Be careful with that fragile white tip. Keep the medium moist, never soaked, for the first week while the roots settle in. Patience matters here more than anything. Rush a seedling into full-strength nutrients too early, and it often fails. Give it a gentle start, and it grows stronger for weeks after. For that first week, feed it nothing but plain water. Wait until you see a second or third true leaf before adding even a weak dose of comfrey or nettle feed. This is exactly how it was done in cold frames and cottage windowsills a century ago. Nothing rushed, because losing a tray of seedlings to impatience simply wasn't an option. Now here's one of the most important steps, and the one most beginners skip completely. Water quality. Rainwater, collected in a simple barrel under a downpipe, was always the country folks' first choice over tap water. No added chlorine, and it naturally sits closer to the balance plant roots prefer. If you're using tap water, let it stand uncovered for 24 hours first. That gives most of the chlorine time to evaporate. You're aiming for a pH between 5.5 and 6.5, just slightly acidic. You don't need an expensive meter for this. Cheap paper test strips, the kind sold for aquariums, will tell you roughly where you stand. Water to alkaline. A small splash of white vinegar brings it down. To acidic, a pinch of bicarbonate of soda raises it back up. Adjust a little at a time, then check again the next day. Water chemistry shifts slowly, and a heavy-handed fix in the afternoon can swing too far the other way by evening. In hard water areas of England, where kettles fur up fast with limescale, tap water often runs naturally alkaline. That's exactly why my grandfather trusted rainwater above everything else. Soft and close to neutral, straight from the sky. Choosing your first crops right will decide whether your early experience feels like a win or a letdown. So start simple. Lettuce grows faster and more forgivingly in water than in soil, often reaching a full head in just 4 weeks. Herbs like basil, mint, and chives root easily from a cutting placed straight into water. Mint roots so easily this way that country households once kept a permanent jar of it on the kitchen windowsill, just for cooking. Feeling confident? Move on to tomatoes and strawberries. Both reward a soilless setup handsomely, as long as you switch to the stronger, comfrey feed once flowering begins. During the war years, these were exactly the crops families were encouraged to grow with whatever space they had, because they gave a fast, reliable return for very little effort. Don't overlook radishes. In water culture, they can be ready to pull in as little as 3 weeks, giving beginners an early win that keeps the motivation alive, while slower crops like tomatoes take their time. Steer clear of long, deep-root vegetables like carrots or parsnips when you're starting out. They need more depth than most small household containers can give, and a disappointing first crop is the fastest way to quit before you've really started. Preventing problems before they start will save you far more trouble than trying to fix them once they appear. The single greatest cause of failure in a beginner's system is root rot, caused by roots sitting too long in water that has gone stagnant or warm. Keep your reservoir out of direct sunlight, ideally in an opaque container, because light reaching the water encourages algae to bloom, and algae competes with your plants for the very oxygen and nutrients they need. My grandfather kept a small piece of clean charcoal in the bottom of every water but he owned, a trick passed down from his own father, because charcoal naturally draws impurities out of standing water and keeps it fresher for far longer than it would otherwise stay. Change your reservoir water fully every 1 to 2 weeks, rather than simply topping it up, and rinse the container each time you do. And you will avoid nearly every problem beginners write to me about. If you do spot roots turning brown and slimy rather than the healthy white you want to see, trim away the affected portion with a clean pair of scissors, refresh the water entirely, and the plant will very often recover within a matter of days. For pests, which trouble indoor systems far less than outdoor gardens but do occasionally appear, a light spray of soapy water made from a plain bar of household soap grated into warm water dealt with greenfly and similar visitors in my grandfather's day, just as effectively as anything bought for the purpose, since feeding your plants on a steady rhythm matters more than feeding them heavily. A weekly top-up of your nettle or comfrey feed, diluted as I described earlier, is enough for most leafy crops, while fruiting plants, such as tomatoes, benefit from a slightly stronger feed once every 10 days as they begin to flower. watch the leaves themselves for guidance, because a plant will tell you plainly what it lacks. Pale yellowing leaves low down on the plant usually point to a shortage of nitrogen, while a plant that flowers weakly or drops its buds early is often asking for more potassium. Purple tinges along the underside of a leaf, particularly on younger plants, often point to a shortage of phosphorus, and a slightly stronger dose of your feed for a week or two usually corrects it without any further trouble. My grandfather always said a garden that is watched closely rarely goes hungry, and the same is true of a system with no soil at all. Temperature is the quiet factor that most beginners never think about until something goes wrong. Most leafy crops and herbs are happiest with a reservoir sitting somewhere between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly the temperature of a comfortably heated farmhouse kitchen rather than anywhere near boiling or freezing. Water that grows to warm loses its ability to hold oxygen, and roots sitting in warm oxygen-poor water are far more prone to the rot I mentioned earlier. In summer, a container kept in direct sun can creep up in temperature far more than people expect, so a shaded spot for the reservoir itself, even while the leaves above sit in full light, is worth arranging. In the depths of an English winter, my grandfather kept his tin baths close to the kitchen range, never so close as to cook the roots, but near enough that the water never dropped. Near freezing overnight, since a chilled reservoir slows a plant's growth to a near standstill. A simple thermometer, the kind sold for a fish tank, costing very little, will tell you exactly where you stand without any guesswork at all. Once you have mastered these smaller systems, and only then, you may want to scale upward to what is called deep water culture, which sounds grander than it truly is. Take a length of rigid foam board, cut holes across it to hold your net pots, and float the whole board directly on the surface of a larger reservoir. A dustbin or a large plastic tub will do perfectly well. A small aquarium air pump, the kind sold cheaply for a garden pond or fish tank, keeps the water gently oxygenated, which allows the roots to draw up far more nutrient than they could in still water. This single upgrade, costing perhaps the price of a modest meal out, can double or even triple the productivity of a small indoor growing space. And it was, in essence, exactly what my grandfather achieved in his tin baths. Long before anyone gave the method its modern name, from here, a continuous harvest becomes possible, because as one crop of lettuce or herbs is cut, a fresh seedling can be started in its place, giving you a rolling supply rather than a single seasonal crop. Keep a simple written record as you go, noting when you started each batch of seedlings and when you harvested, because after only a season or two, you will find yourself able to time your household's supply almost to the week, exactly as my grandfather once managed with nothing more than a pencil and a page pinned inside the pantry door. This kind of steady, rolling rhythm was the real secret behind how a single farmhouse kitchen could keep a family in fresh greens through months when the fields outside offered nothing at all. What strikes me most, looking back on all of this, is how little of it was ever truly complicated. My grandfather never owned a single piece of equipment that could not be found in a farmhouse, kitchen, or hardware shop, and yet he fed a family through years when the shops themselves had precious little to offer. What was lost was not the knowledge itself, because the knowledge was never especially difficult to begin with. What was lost was the confidence that ordinary households once had in their own hands. A confidence that has quietly been replaced by a belief that you must buy your way into growing your own food. That belief was never true, and it still is not true today. I think of my grandfather often when I pass a shop shelf of expensive growing kits, most of them promising something he achieved decades ago with a tin bath and a length of old rope. He never once thought of himself as clever for doing it. To him, it was simply what a sensible the household did, and nothing more remarkable than mending a fence or banking the fire for the night. Anyone with a windowsill, a jam jar, and a little patience can reclaim exactly what my grandfather once had. And there is a quiet satisfaction in that which no amount of shop-bought produce can ever quite match. If this is useful to you, there are more methods where this came from. I share a new one. Every day, the old ways are still here. You just have to know where to look.